Hello and welcome to Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm Ksenia Chmutin, I'm the director of the IIS, and it's wonderful to see you all here in the room. I can hear that there are quite a lot of people, and there's those of us who are online as well. Welcome to the seminar. We're absolutely delighted to welcome our first residential fellow of this academic year, Arnoud Arps. Arnoud, welcome to the IIS. Arnold has been with us for a couple of weeks now, enjoying the really great, miserable weather of November and December in the UK. Hopefully you've been staying warm. And as always at the IIS, we are discussing the most exciting, the most kind of controversial and important issues that are happening around the world and that we're all facing today. And I think the conversation today around kind of memory and popular culture will be one of those topics as well, and the topic of interest to many, of course. Just a couple of house rules. Arnoud will introduce himself and then give a presentation, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for Q&A as well. For those in the room, of course, the IIS team will take the questions, but for those of you online, please post the questions in the Q&A section, and we will make sure that we pass this to Arnoud as well at the end of the session. The presentation will be recorded, and then we will be posting it on our YouTube channel and also as a podcast, but we are only recording the presentation, not the Q&A part of this discussion. And that's it from me. So without any further ado, Arnoud, over to you, and welcome to the IIS.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. A lot of pressure also now, obviously, for this talk, in the sense of how does it fit with the aims of the IIS, but I'll explain in a second actually what I am doing here. I want to thank everybody online. I heard that there were quite a few. I don't know if they are because I can see them, but I also want to thank everybody here. People coming from Nottingham, from Indonesia, so that's great. What I'm going to present today is work in progress, obviously. This is a work in progress seminar, and it is, or will be, the idea is my first book project that draws from my PhD dissertation and another article that I'll explain in a second. And it broadly deals with the question of how the Indonesian War of Independence is remembered in Indonesia through Indonesian popular culture. And I will delve into this in a second, but first maybe explain who I am. The slides will take some time to load because I have images, as you can see, that are quite big in size, and otherwise I'll press it there. But I'm from the Media Studies Department at the University of Amsterdam, so in that sense I'm very used to this weather, unfortunately, but yes, I've been keeping warm. And I'm an assistant professor of extended cinema, film heritage, and memory. Won't explain what that means, but what I'll focus on today is, and the latter part mainly, is memory. And I'm also part of the Amsterdam School for Heritage, Memory, and Material Culture, where I'm a staff member, and there's a bridge to what I'm presenting today, so I'll explain that in a second. And as you know, as scholars, you need to write a biography often if you submit for a conference, etc. So this is from one of the author bios that I needed to write. But what I broadly do is I investigate the colonial era, the Dutch colonial era in Indonesia, and how that is transculturally, transnationally, and cross-media remembered in Indonesia and the Netherlands. So I look at Indonesian popular culture, but increasingly also Dutch popular culture, and then also in relation to each other. So how do they mainly differ? But also what does it mean to compare them? Today I won't compare, actually. Today I will focus mainly on Indonesia, or only. I have a special interest in cinema, literature, and popular culture, which has overlap. And I will show you in a second what that means for today. But as I said, I'm part of the AHM in Amsterdam. Wait, can I click here? Yeah. And which is a research school where people who study memory also come together. And one of the aims of the school is to analyze the remnants and narratives of the past and the present. And that is pretty much what I'm doing here. What I'm doing always, actually. That's the work that I do. That's also what I did at the IIS. And then the question, perhaps, why did I come here? What as Loughborough that is interesting for me? What can I offer Loughborough in that sense? And that is, and this is outside of the IIS, this is at the Loughborough University, is the Center for Research in Communication and Culture. And they have scholars who work on media, obviously, and communication, but media mainly the focus of my work. And they do that quite well, obviously. Some of you might work there also, actually some of you do. And one of the, how do they present itself? Let's say research priority areas, one of the expertise topics is media, memory, and history. So that relation between media, memory, and history. And so this particular research group or cohort, if you will, was one of the main reasons why I came here to Loughborough to meet these people, these scholars, to collaborate with them, these experts in my field, and to discuss research with scholars from the media, memory, and history cohorts. And the IAS specifically offers a place to do that, to stay and to work on my own work, as well as collaborate with the people who already work here. And I came here particularly for one professor, who is Professor Emily Keatley, who have been discussing my work with, who've been talking to, and will continue to do as long as I'm here. And it is in particular maybe one of her research, how you say this, scopes that is particularly interesting for me, which is how media studies, memory studies, and post-colonial studies should or could work together. And so when I was thinking, presenting here today at the Institute of Advanced Studies, I was thinking, what is it actually that I'm advancing? Like, what kind of studies am I advancing? And I think that is the answer. So it's, for me, particularly the relation between media studies, memory studies, and post-colonial studies, and what I'm presenting today. And I think this book in particular has to do with those three fields, maybe today focusing mostly on memory studies. So how is the past remembered in the present? And it has to do, let me see if that's on this slide, that's mainly to do with how within the field of memory studies, how people look at a form of global mobility of memory. So how certain memories of the past are seen as having the capacity to be a global memory. And one example, I think, is the memory of the Holocaust. That's something that's been represented so fastly, so widely, etc., that people across the globe have a certain memory, a cultural memory of what that means. And my point here is that the research within memory studies goes increasingly towards this idea of that memory is able to travel freely, to become a global memory. Whereas I think, that's my argument, that in Indonesia it shows that let's say the nation or national memories are pretty much reinstated. I'll come back to this in a second. Let me begin here. As I said, the book that I'm writing is the rewritten version, the revised version of my PhD dissertation. And when I had finalized my PhD, the journal Memory Studies came with a call for papers. And that call for papers was for a special issue called Taking Stock of Memory Studies, in which they asked the questions, how do newer scholars, which I interpreted as recently promoted scholars, as in just getting their doctorate, how do they assess changes in the field? How useful are established concepts in the current moment? Do they need to be reinvented or reframed or even discarded? What is new? What would an agenda for the future look like? So this was a journal issue that really looked at what is sort of the status quo of memory studies, the field, and where should we head towards from there. And what I did in my dissertation, which I will do in my book, is to look at this idea that theories in memory studies of the past decades, actually, that they pretty much suggest that memory can travel freely across political, cultural, and national borders. So you have increasingly theories that suggest that. But my book project, and the one that's also the one that I've been working on here in Loughborough, argues that Indonesian popular culture shows that this idea of straightforward mobility of memory does not necessarily apply to every local context, because when memory travels, or the form of travel that we see in Indonesia, what we see is that there are some frictions that occur. I will explain this. Hopefully it will be explained, but I will delve into this in a second. Now, as I said, the book draws from the PhD dissertation, but it also draws from this specific article, which has similar titles on Memori Melompat, dumping memory. And I'll explain what that means in a second. Also, I would suggest, if you are interested in this topic, you should read the article rather than listen to my rambling here, because I think it's more structured there than it will be here. But today I'm trying to give you a few examples, mostly, which I think are not in the article as much. Three set of quotes that I want to give you from the article. First, I recognize that there are certain cultural memories of the Indonesian War of Independence, and I propose to see these cultural memories as a form of Memori Melompat, and it is composed of the Indonesian Memori, meaning memory, and Melompat, meaning jumping or to jump, thus translating into jumping memory. And why did I choose to focus on such a term? Well, it encapsulates both time through Memori and space through Melompat, because time and space in this particular book project are of importance. Secondly, Memori Melompat is an abbreviation for cultural memories that jump rather than travel between forms of popular culture. Because there's, and I won't go into this, but there's this whole idea of traveling memory also. And I would say that yes, this is a form of such memory, but it is to a different scale. It's a different kind of movement. So there are jumps between forms of popular culture, between intra and international borders and people, and that is what makes that different. In the context of the Indonesian War of Independence, these memories create meaning about how colonial oppression informs post-colonial nationalism. So what I pretty much focused on, and I think it's makes sense if you look at what the Indonesian War of Independence is, which I will explain in a second, is how colonial oppression, or the end of colonial oppression, rather, how that informs post-colonial nationalism. So how does the harking back or going back to the Indonesian War of Independence tell something about how nationalism exists today in Indonesia after they gained their independence? So that is pretty much what that part means. And then lastly, the article, and thus also this is the gist of the book, it argues that Indonesia's jumping memory remains consistently close to its point of departure, as there's always a sense of nationalism involved. In other words, Memori Melompat is always about the nation, and even though it jumps away from it, like stretched elastic, it inevitably snatches back to it. For those who speak Indonesian, it's like karet. So it's like an elastic that is stretched out and comes back. This is the jumping motion, which I hope to explain here today a little bit more, and certainly in the future. Now, in the book, I try to answer how the cultural memories of the Indonesian War of Independence are being produced and represented by contemporary popular culture. And I sought, or I will try to find out, try to define what the roles of popular culture and how the colonial past is viewed in Indonesia today. So that's also, I think, a crucial point to mention here. So in particular, the Indonesian War of Independence between 1945 and 1949. I have a slide about that in a second as well. But I think what's important to note here is that, that the research that I do is not historical in the sense that I study cultural memory. So it is how the past is represented in popular culture today, instead of tracing, for instance, historical reality of that particular past, of the particular period, or trying to test the veracity of representations. I rather focus on representation and meaning. But what does that exactly mean? That's maybe then a question. So I would like you to take a closer look at this. I look at representation and meaning. I want to you to take a closer look at this cover. Very happy with the cover. My wife designed it for me, which I'm very happy with. But the question is, what do you see and what does it mean? Maybe this is a rhetorical question. Maybe I'll answer it in the end. Maybe I'll ask you to answer it. But what I want you to do is take a closer look at the cover, and to take in the image specifically, and to look at the pattern surrounding the image. Try to figure out, maybe think about what it means for you now at this particular moment. I'm referring to the patterns here in the particular image. But what do you see? What do you think that means? And perhaps it makes it easier to answer that question at the very end. So I'll ask this question again at the very end, but I ask this now for two reasons. First, because this actually, what I'm asking you is a simplification of what I've been doing in recent years and what the book also does, which is that I've analyzed, and in my case, these are audiovisual elements, I analyze audiovisual elements and trace their meaning based on, let's say, observable and verifiable facts, empirical in that sense. And secondly, because the combination of these visual elements, they tell a story, right? And I will explain you the narrative that is formed in Indonesia about the War of Independence through a few case studies. And then I will come back to discover at the very end. So keep your answers to these questions in mind. I'm curious, what you think about this, whether this works or not. I think it works. Okay, but because we are in the UK, even though in the Netherlands I've done this also, I would like to explain a little bit what the period is that I'm talking about. And this is just to note also, this is for those of you who are not familiar with Indonesia's history. This is a crude summary of Indonesian history in linear phases. And this you can criticize. There are people who criticize this idea of Indonesian history in linear phases. I won't go into that, but look at the work of Anne McClintock and Stoller to see how colonialism, post-colonialism, etc., is more of a continuous process rather than linear. But just for clarity's sake, a crude history of Indonesian, a crude overview of Indonesian history. So first of all, let's say the pre-colonial, before the arrival of Europeans, including the UK, of course, and the Dutch, and then the colonial period. This is pretty much a Indonesian history linear phases from an Indonesian perspective. And why do I say that? Because you talk, or I write here about Dutch occupation and Japanese occupation as well. So the Japanese occupation is a colonial period. And what's important to note, I think, is one, that this is a pretty long time. And secondly, then there was the Japanese occupation, 1942, 1945. And then in 1945, so I think August 1945, Indonesia became independent. So that is the date on which Indonesia became independent. And then, should I say it, the Netherlands disagreed with Indonesia being independent. So the Indonesian War of Independence commenced, which was from the 17th of August 1945 to 27th December 1949, crudely. But this is the period that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the period after Indonesia declared its independence, but before the Dutch stopped waging war in Indonesia again. One point to note here also maybe, I think I'll come back to that in the end, is the fact that we're talking about the end of the Second World War in Europe also, and then the beginning of the Indonesian War of Independence. So as you can see here already, there's a overlap or continuation between, for instance, the German occupation of the Netherlands and the Dutch reoccupation of Indonesia. And this is crucial later on. I don't know if it's today, but it is crucial. Yeah, I think they have an example of that later on. But this is the period that I'm talking about. When I started this project, I was in the Netherlands, and from the Netherlands, there's only so much that you can select in relation to Indonesian popular culture. And this actually has to do with one of the main points. It has to do with circulation. But I knew that in Indonesia, also because I was there before, but in Indonesia, there's this huge remembrance culture about the Indonesian War of Independence. And from the Netherlands, you only have access to a small part of it. So I needed to go to Indonesia to see what does that actually look like. And one thing to note here is that the Indonesian War of Independence is everywhere in Indonesia. If you look for it, which I did, but I assume also if you don't look for it. One example. No, I'll go through the examples, I think, yeah. This is just an overview, nice image, but I go to this one. Everybody, if anybody's been to Indonesia, I assume you have, Jakarta, Kota Tua. What you see here is an image of someone who is paid this actor, who is, I think, a VOC, a Dutch colonial, and who's standing here as a prisoner of Batavia's old city and is taking photographs. But what you can also do there, if you walk around the old city of Jakarta, is you can take pictures of people who dress up as national heroes. I think I haven't included here, but General Sudirman, for instance, there are many national heroes that are standing there and that you can take pictures with. It's one form in which it comes back. Another one, more traditional, I would say, is Wayang Revolusi. So Wayang, shadow puppet theater in Indonesia, still hugely popular also, but this is a particular form of it in which the revolution, the Indonesian War of Independence, is recreated. And so I think, I don't have my notes about that, that these were Dutch people represented here. You can find this also in Jakarta. Another example, and this I've made this joke before, so sorry for everybody who has heard another talk about me saying this, but what is a more popular form of culture in Indonesia than food? There isn't, is my point. And so when I found out in Jakarta that there is a restaurant around Fathahila Square, which has the theme of Indonesian independence, and I had to try it. And in the dining area, the wall and ceiling, yeah, you can see it here, are decorated with national heroes and images of the war. And you can see this on the back of the wall here, for instance. So you see the imageries of the national revolution, the heroes, and the war itself. And the waiters in the restaurant, and I don't know, I don't have a picture of that here, but the waiters in the restaurant, they also walk around in uniforms that hint or are reminiscent of the color and shape of the uniform of the TNI, of the Indonesian army during the war. So it all has this, let's say, air of the revolution. And also, of course, I tried the food because there was an excuse to do it as part of research, which was good. It was also the first time that I can actually remember that I ate otak, which is brain, which apparently makes you smarter. And I'm at the Institute of Advanced Studies, so perhaps that is true. But at least this is one form of Indonesian popular culture, if you will, about that. More traditional one also. One of the famous landmarks in Indonesia is the National Monument, which you can see on the right. And when you enter the monument, there's a National History Museum. And one of the things that is super popular in Indonesian museums are dioramas. These you can see in many different kinds of museums in Indonesia with different kinds of images of the war. Now, questions can be raised on which particular aspect of the war is represented, but also why and for what purpose, etc. These you can ask with all these kinds of forms of popular culture, but these are not necessarily the case studies that I focused on. Also, another thing, and this is actually, I really like this one, I don't know if you know this, is a clothing brand. Damn, I love Indonesia. And this is, what was the slogan? Patriotism never looked so good. Also, I bought shirts here, of course. But this is also a form of popular culture where you can ask, well, does it have to do with patriotism? Is it nationalism? Is it just a way to show that you have money because these are relatively expensive clothing, etc.? So these are all kinds of questions that you could ask. But this was not one of the case studies, again, that ended up in the book. But just to make sure that you understand that there's so much about it. When I actually, and I will show what I did focus on, but what I actually theorize, or how to put this, I think, into theory is, first of all, the question is so broad. If you ask the question, how does Indonesia remember Indonesian War of Independence? That's a question that you really can't answer. Also, because in a country as diverse and vast, with so many people, you can't really say that there's a singular memory of the Indonesian War of Independence, but rather that you need to focus on different kinds of, or multiple memories of the Indonesian War of Independence. So I tried to sort of, how you say it, streamline an argument about how you can say something about such so many multiple memories, so many memories, etc. And I think I did it okay with this. First, mediality. So mediality here implies that memories of the war are unthinkable without media. So this also might be a research bias in the sense that I'm from media studies, but many of the forms, whether they are only media, if you will, or traditionally something else initially, they use media in a particular way to form their memories. So mediality here implies that memories of the war are unthinkable without media. Secondly, scales imply that these memories move from a local level, for instance, the city of Yogyakarta, to a national level, as in nationalist films, to a more global perspective, as through YouTube. This is not random that I named this. This is something that comes back in the book. And if time allows, I'll come back to later on. But how things move from, let's say, a local level of a certain city to a more national level to a global perspective, or the idea of a global perspective. And then mobility implies that memories of the Indonesian War of Independence are not stationary, right? So these memories move between people, media, genres, locations, and times. That's another thing. And I think the foundational observation of this book, of this study, is that Contemporary memory culture about the war in Indonesia is inherently temporal, as it inevitably relates to the colonial past, and increasingly prosthetic. Now, I need to explain that. It comprises of mediated cultural memories of the war rather than personally experienced memories. So the idea that it is prosthetic means here, and the role of media here is that as time goes by, people who have lived memories of the war, who were actually alive during the Indonesian War of Independence, they will die because of age. And then what happens is that our understanding of the past, our understanding of the Indonesian War of Independence, increasingly relies on how that war has been mediated. And there, I think, also lies an extra importance of media. So, and the last part, I think, is also that it's spatial. Again, so it relates to the local, to the national, and to beyond. Now, I'll go further. One of the case studies that I did focus on in the end was historical reenactment. And this is also, depending on where you live in the world, more familiar to you than for others. But what this is I assume you have an idea what historical reenactment is, right? Broadly speaking, it's, in this case, people who reenact battles during the Indonesian War of Independence on the streets. And they do that by wearing the clothing from that period, trying to find weapons from that period, or recreating them, having objects, having vehicles, etc., etc. This is what historical reenactment is. And historical reenactment in Indonesia centers on theatricals, which are the street performances of the key battles. But they also focus heavily on the subsequent images that they circulate of these performances on Instagram. It's mainly Instagram, it's also WhatsApp and Facebook, but Instagram is the most important one, I would say. And both the street performances themselves, as the images that are circulated later on, construct a memory that critically imagines, negotiates, and contests the past through the mediality and mobility of a local scale of memory that also jumps to the national identity formation, because it has to do with how Indonesia as a nation remembers its past. Now, there's a difference between cultural, between prosthetic, personal, and collective memory. And also it's not clearly divided, since the reenactments are personally embodied memories and the images afterwards a mediation for a broader audience. You see that different prosthetic memories are folded into each other. This is, I find, too complicated to explain here. I have one example. I'll try to explain this. Hopefully this works. To show how memories are different kinds of memories are sort of folded into each other. Consider the jumping memory example in which one reenactor, take one of these reenactors, that particular reenactor channels memories of his grandfather, who was an actual soldier during the Indonesian War of Independence, to shape the way he dresses, the way he acts during the reenactment of a local battle in Yogyakarta. So you have a reenactor, his grandfather was in the war, and as a form of respect, he recreates, as it were, his grandfather into the way he reenacts the Indonesian War of Independence. So that is a familial memory, a familial relation between the reenactor and his grandfather, but he's part of a reenactment. And that reenactment says something in Indonesia about how the Indonesian War of Independence is remembered. Moreover, that particular reenactment is not randomly on a street, but rather at a school in Indonesia. Because one of the things that these reenactors do is they actually go to schools to reenact battles as a form of telling how history was, how the past was, how these things played out, etc. Now, so you have then a personal memory, a familial memory that goes into a local memory of Yogyakarta, because these are battles of Yogyakarta that tell something about how Indonesia became independent on a national level. But then also there's the element of photographs that are circulated on Instagram beyond the street performance themselves. What you see on the Instagram page is, and this is a case study, well, it's a part of the case study of the historical reenactors, but it is an object in itself, is what you see there is that images like these that are then put on Instagram are actually put besides images of the historical reenactors, for instance, when they are talking to the Indonesian army. And what they do with that, or what's constructed with that, I would say, is that it signifies some sort of military approval for what they do, and in that sense gives them a, let's say, gravitas, or some form of authority about the particular history that they're telling, and the particular cultural memory that they are forming through the historical reenactment. So that's one difficult example, I think. Let me see. Yeah, so just to say what is jumping here, memory jumps from the reenactors themselves to street audiences and online audiences, as well as from offline activities to online representation. As such, doing Indonesian reenactment in its full extent means committing oneself to various forms of media to jump from the local to the national scale. And this really is an example of how reenactors in Yogyakarta say something about a national cultural memory in a way. But if you go to films, this is differently, because these films operate on a more, let's say, the level of the nation. They're more focusing on memory discourses on a national level. And here you also have an entanglement of the three threads that I said in the beginning, and you can mainly see it through, let's say, memory tropes in cinema. So these memory tropes interact also with memory outside of the nation. But they are highly national at the same time. So you have global tropes such as the soldier figure, the figure of the perpetrator, and the hero figure. I mean, if I ask you to give an example of perpetratorship, of heroism, of a soldier figure in war films from any different in any given national context, then I'm sure that you can give an example. But so these are, let's say, global tropes, but they interact on a very specific level with Indonesian tropes from Indonesian memory discourses. And one illustration is how the personality of the Dutch perpetrator Robert, who's Dutch, in Garin Nugroho Sugiya, on the right, how he is connected to the German occupation of the Netherlands, as I said in the beginning. So in this particular film, it is shown how the Indonesian reoccupation by the Dutch is very much connected to the German occupation of the Netherlands. And what that does is it not only links two historical periods to each other, but it also frames the Dutch character there as actually first a victim of occupation and then a perpetrator of occupation. So in a way, you could say there's a humanizing factor going on in relation to the antagonist of the film. This is such an interesting film, an important film, I find, and also so different from the others, that I'm actually writing another book on that one, a smaller one, but I actually need to finish this one first and then focus on that one, but that is coming as well. And another example is, these were the case studies. This is an animated film. This is an Indonesian war film. This is more, let's say, archetypical Hollywood war film, if you think about that. This is an animated film, which is more unique on multiple levels. And then Sugiya is a historical drama film, which is also quite different because it focuses on, I don't have time for that, but it focuses on different kinds of topics than the other films do. Should I focus on this? Looking at time. Yeah, I think this is interesting. This is the most, I would say, the Merah-Putih trilogy is the most famous one. I don't know if you've seen it. Yeah, okay. This is also the one that actually has been circulated in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, this is the most famous one, although hardly people have seen it. But this is really like an action film, a war film. You look at the trailer, you will see what I mean. But what you see in that film, which is a film that is archetypical war film, like explosions, violence, etc. Even there, you see that there's, let's say, disagreement in the dedication towards the Indonesian War of Independence, particularly in relation to, let's say, the ethics of what that war means for Indonesia itself, and how far you should push it, even though the antagonist of the film is pretty much the worst of the worst, if you will. So what you see there is that there is a negotiation again of how the Indonesian War of Independence should be seen, also within the film itself. And in the films, I won't focus on that too much now. You see there are distinct genres. There is a dissimilarity in mediality. You see also how films actually work differently in relation to cultural memory if you compare it to historical reenactment. So this focuses on, as I said, tropes of the soldier, the incorporation of European history narratives, representation of perpetrators that maybe aren't purely evil per se, etc., etc. So it engages with national memory motives differently. One important thing maybe also to mention about these kinds of films is that they are memory productive films. So these films are what Astrid Errol has called memory productive films. That is, they don't necessarily tell us something about the workings of memory. If you think about a film like what's the Total Recall, I think is the example also that's given. But it doesn't necessarily tell us something about how memory works, but it produces memories about the past. So tells little or nothing about the workings of memory, but they have led to the powerful global dissemination of images of the past. This is a distinction that Astrid Errol makes, although there's one point I would say is to what extent can we talk about global dissemination of images of the past if we talk about Indonesian popular culture? And that's actually one point, is that to what extent is there a form of mobility similar to Saving Private Ryan, Apocalypse Now, or Schindler's List? Because to come back to the beginning, the theories in memory studies pretty much aim at these kinds of films and talk about how these kinds of films travel boundaries of culture, of politics, etc., etc. But this really isn't exactly the same in Indonesia. There are different kinds of memories. And I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, because not every memory should travel freely. It's not that it's bad if it doesn't, but there's a difference there for sure. And then one thing I also wanted to point out, I think, is that especially if you come from the Netherlands, the expectation is that a lot of these films are films about a war in which Indonesia fights against the Netherlands. To a certain extent they are, but one important point also is that these films are very much about Indonesia themselves. So Indonesia is the most important thing. This is an example, I would say, got at 947, because, and this is a film about the Indonesian Air Force in the beginning of the Indonesian War of Independence, which isn't necessarily, there wasn't really an Air Force, there's also a point in the film, but this story is far more about a group of soldiers fighting against the odds, about how they deal together, about solidarity, about heroism, not so much about the antagonist. As a matter of fact, you can count the scenes with the Dutch in this film on one hand, if even. So it's really about Indonesia, not about the Netherlands. And where you can also see that it's about Indonesia and not the Netherlands is this film, Battle of Surabaya, one of the most important battles of the Indonesian War of Independence, and it's actually fought between the UK, between England, between the British and Indonesia. To make it more problematic, actually between the Gurkhas and Indonesia. But no Netherlands as much in this film. So it's about Indonesia. Okay, last two examples. Let me see the time. Just a few things. This is too much text I see on my slide. I don't want to read it. But this is one thing that I found also quite striking is if you look at historical reenactment, you look at more like a global stage. These reenactments, they are either in Jogja, they are in Bandung, they are in Jakarta, they are in a particular city mostly, and focus on the history of that particular city. The films are, let's say, on a national level in terms of distribution, in terms of memory tropes that they deal with, in terms of the stories, etc. Also, the characters in these films are often from across Indonesia. So you have these two scales. So let's say local, national, and then you have this guy. His name is Alfie Rev. He's a DJ, an Indonesian DJ. And he started out, I think, with remixing, let's say, popular English language pop music, but it wasn't as successful. I mean, I think it was successful, but it wasn't as successful as when he started to remix or make reiterations of Lagu Perjuangan, Lagu Nasional, which are, let's say, more traditional songs about the Indonesian War of Independence, about the Indonesian nation. And what he did is he remixed them. I think I don't call it a remix, but well, just to make it easy, he remixes them by combining electronic dance music together with traditional gamelan music. So what he does is he plays with this idea of, let's say, modernity and tradition, whatever that may mean, and then he creates a remix of more traditional songs. And this was hugely popular, hugely popular. And this is where I think he mainly got his fame, but also this is what is most important to me. So what I did is I looked at how does he remix these, let's say, older traditional songs, and what kind of music videos also does he have with it. And he puts this on YouTube, millions of views. And what's interesting for me is, again, the combination between audio and video, audio-visual combination, and then the tropes that he has in there. And I won't go into that, but it has to do with tropes like the homeland, and gender is important here, etc. What's also important here, I think, to mention is that some memories are more portable and transportable than others. And you would expect maybe that this is most apparent in with YouTube, right? The possibilities of online video platforms such as YouTube. The idea that people have is that it can reach the world in a way. So you could say that, okay, this is then the way to reach a global audience in relation to the Indonesian War of Independence. And it has it, of course. YouTube provides the potential for global affiliations. For instance, what he does is he has English subtitles, so it sort of suggests that there is a wish to sort of cater to a more international audience. But in the end, rather, what you see is that Indonesian nationalistic music videos, they construct something similar to what you can call, what Cunningham has called a national demarked YouTube space. So even though there are, let's say, sort of jumps towards global pop culture, if you will, through YouTube, and through the affordances that YouTube offers, rather, it still remains very much within an Indonesian realm. And again, this is not something that is a negative thing, but this is an observation, I would say. Okay, so again, it has to do with spatial elements. It has to do with temporality. There's a few images in the book. I analyzed also the locations where he's filmed, the superimposition of, for instance, Sukarno, images of the military, national heroes who were important during the war, etc., etc. So this is all this combination of, let's say, the war and you can see it here, but there's more like a classical orchestra rather than traditional gamelan, but he also has gamelan. And it's just this juxtaposition between, let's say, old and new in a way. And then the last part, which I don't want to say much about also, is literature, because this is a chapter that I'm still working on also. So I mean, this is work in progress, as I said, that's why this is rambling. But what's, I think, fascinating here is that if you look at how the Indonesian War of Independence is remembered in the Netherlands, then you can see that there are a lot of novels or historical novels written about it, whereas there are hardly any films in the Netherlands. If you switch that around and you look at Indonesia, you see that there are many, many films, starting from the 1950s, and much less literature, much less novels. One thing to note there is that I'm specifically talking about pop culture from the last 2 decades. If you go further, like Pramujan Antatur, of course, etc., has written extensively on the Indonesian War of Independence, but I'm looking at, let's say, my case study from 2009 to 2019. And here, much less so. But one of the most striking examples, one of the most striking case studies is by Iksaka Bandung, who's written a collection of short stories, Semua untuk India, all for the Indies, it's translated to, which has been partly translated to English. But what he does and what's fascinating is that he writes all these stories through the perspective of the Dutch. And I see this as a way of writing back. Like in post-colonial studies, when you talk about writing back, this is often also, this relates to the language of the former colonizer. So this would be when Indonesian authors would write in Dutch about histories that are underrepresented because of Dutch colonization. But because of, for instance, language politics, Indonesians didn't have the same access to Dutch education, or hardly any, as compared to other maybe colonial and post-colonial countries. But what he does there is to offer a perspective by switching focalization. So he looks at Dutch characters, or rather he looks through Dutch characters to tell the history of Indonesia. And there are a few short stories that I focus on that are post-colonial short stories about the Indonesian War of Independence, though his Semua Untuk India actually covers pretty much the whole Dutch colonization. But it's a fascinating thing. So I would focus on that. I'll wrap up due to time. But maybe first this. I wanted to ask you, as I said, about the cover. And I was curious. I asked two questions. One was, what do you see? And the second was, what might this mean? I was just curious about whether, especially after the talk, you have any insights on maybe the people that we see or the pattern that we see here. If anybody wants to answer. If not, I'll answer.
It's a group of national heroes.
Exactly. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. Indeed, that's correct. What you see here are heroes of the nation. These are not necessarily only heroes of the War of Independence, but resistance to colonial rule in a broad sense. And then the pattern that you see ties into this. This is the idea. The coloring is reminiscent of a military camouflage uniform, sort of hinting towards the military in a way. And at the same time, you recognize the hearts, which shows, let's say, hero worship. And this is important also, that despite the historical context of these forms of popular culture being war, victimhood is not necessarily the main focus of Indonesian popular culture. So these films, if you look at, let's say, through a decolonial perspective, and you think about what actually do these films or these forms of popular culture deal with, then it's not so much victimhood of Dutch colonialism, which you easily could do, of course, but rather it focuses on all these kinds of elements of heroism, unity, etc., etc. And this is not for nothing, because the book shows that the Indonesian War of Independence is, or should be understood as a discursive canvas, right? So it's a canvas on which everyone paints their needs and aspirations. And I'm talking about political factors, I'm talking about producers of popular culture, but I'm also talking about people who are, for instance, historical reenactors. So this goes from a very individual level to a global level. This idea that the Indonesian War of Independence is a discursive canvas on which everyone paints their needs and aspiration. And this is from Homi Bhabha, but much like the nation is coming into being through narration, the Indonesian nation comes into being through the narration of its birth myth. And the birth myth really is the Indonesian War of Independence here. And as I said, this applies to the political actors, to cultural producers, to society at large. And each of them participate in a narrativizing project that helps to define the Indonesian War of Independence and its meaning of freedom, which is Merdeka, after Indonesian independence. So that's why this is actually, as I said, the cover of the dissertation. It's called Forever Narrating Merdeka, because it is the argument that through popular culture, the idea of Merdeka, of Indonesian freedom, is pretty much narrated continuously. I'll stop there, actually. Thank you very much for your attention and time.